Hello everybody, welcome to the CSS3 course. In this video, I'm going to discuss the ways to set up some grids on your web page. So before I discuss this topic, let me show you the HTML file corresponding to the web page. And you can see that this HTML file has a lot of headings, and below the headings, I have a number of divisions. And in each division, I even have some inner divisions. So the inner divisions are mainly shown on the right-hand side of the screen in the form of some elements on a web page. So let me scroll it down. So this kind of pattern repeats for a number of times in order to help you discuss the ways to set up the grids on a web page. And for some of the divisions, I have also set up some classes. Okay, so I may use this kind of class names to help me determine the styles on the CSS file. Okay, so that is the end of the HTML file. And let me show you the CSS file. So the CSS file is mainly responsible for setting up the colors of the items, as well as the background color of my divisions. Now, the background color is not that easily shown because all the background colors are hidden by the elements. Okay, so let me scroll it down. You can see that I mainly set up the background color of the container as well as the borders for my items. Okay. So same for many other kinds of divisions. Okay, it is near the end of the CSS file. Okay, so it is the end of the CSS file. So in order to discuss the grid, I have to say something beforehand. So what is a grid layout? A grid layout is simply a two-dimensional layout model. So we just want to set the items along the horizontal axis and along the vertical axis in short. So how can we do the grids? Let me try to set up the simple grids first. I have to make use of the keyword called display, and then I set it up as grid. And then I'm going to set up the grids after using this attribute value pair. Then I can set up the number of columns as well as the width of each column. Okay, now grid template columns is simply telling the computer to set two columns. One column has a width of 150 pixels, and the second column has a pixel size of 100. So you can see that I have two columns already. And since I have 7 elements, you can see that the current settings of the column dimensions is not able to hide all the background colors. So now you can see the background color indicated by this color, pale golden rod. Okay. And I can have another way to set up the grid template columns. So I can make use of the fractions. So how can I do that? Let me see. Now when I set up one fraction for the first column, I will simply occupy one portion of the total of 3 portions of my viewport width. So when I enlarge the window, you can see that the first column is able to cover 1/3 of the entire viewport width, and the remaining size of the viewport width is covered by the second column. So you see the fractions are simply controlling the portion of the columns to occupy on a certain viewport size. Okay. In addition to using pixels and fractions solely, I can combine the two representations together. Okay, so now I have 100 pixels wide for the first column, and the remaining portions of the field port size is controlled by the two values shown here. 2 fractions for the second column and 1 fraction for the third column. So when I enlarge the screen again, you can see that the first column has a fixed width, but the second column has 2 portions of the remaining space of the field port size, and the third column has 1 fraction of the remaining field port size after deducting the fixed amount of 100 pixels from the original field port size. Okay. So that's why we can combine 2 types of measurements together. In addition to setting up the column dimension, we can also set up the row dimension so that we can have a 2-dimensional layout. How can we do that? We can make use of another property called grid template rows. Okay, now you can see that I have 4 rows being set up, and the 4th row isn't able to be filled up by the elements. That means you can see the background color again on the 4th row of the container. Okay, so the first row has a size of 40 pixels, and the second row has a size of 60 pixels. The third row has a size of 30 pixels, and the 4th row, which is not filled up, has a size of 50 pixels. Okay, so this is the way to set up the column dimension as well as the row dimensions. In addition to using pixels or fractions, we can make use of the repeat function to help me set up the dimensions for your rows and columns. How can we do that? We can make use of the repeat functions in this way. Okay, you can see that I have used the repeat function in this way. I want to repeat this pattern for 4 times. What's the pattern? 50 pixels of the row size and 30 pixels for the size of another row. So in this case, I have 50 pixels for the first row, and for the second row, I have 30 pixels. And then I will repeat this pattern for 3 more times. So the third row has a size of 50 pixels, and the 4th row, which is unoccupied, has a size of 30 pixels. And then for the 5th row and the 6th row, I have 50 pixels and 30 pixels respectively. And then for the 7th row and the 8th row, I have 50 pixels and 30 pixels respectively. So this is the way to do the repeat function. Okay, so you can make use of any kinds of measurements to determine the row dimensions as well as your column dimensions. Okay, the next topic is called implicit grid. So let me go to the corresponding portion on the HTML file as well as the CSS file. So what's the meaning of the word implicit grids? Actually, implicit grids are set up automatically when we don't really specify the grid template columns or the grid template rows. So in my previous example, I set up both properties explicitly. So in this case, the column and the row dimensions are set up firmly. And then if we don't set up any one of the 2 dimensions, that dimension is called the implicit grid dimension. So we can see an example here. Before I play with this property, I have to set up the display mode again. So now I'm playing with grids. Now I set up the column dimensions. Okay, you can see that 1 portion is given to the first column and 2 portions are given to the second column. Okay, now the column dimension is set up explicitly, and in this case, the row dimension is regarded as the implicit grid dimension. So when it comes to handling the implicit grid dimension, I can make use of the property called grid auto rows. So you can see that after setting up this property, each row has a dimension of 50 pixels. And remember, the row dimension is now the implicit grid dimensions, okay? But when we set up a fixed amount of pixels for the grid auto rows value, it is possible to have this kind of problem. You can see that on this grid cell, the content is not able to be shown completely when the size is fixed for each row. So how can we handle this situation? We can make use of the min-max function to handle it. Let me see the effect when I use the min-max function. Okay, the min-max function is something like this. The minimum amount to show is 30 pixels for my row dimension, which is an implicit grid dimension, and the maximum size for the row dimension is auto. That means it just occupies the necessary space to show all the contents. So you can see that all the words can be shown by using the auto dimension for my implicit grid. Okay. As another example, we can demonstrate it on the second part of this section. We demonstrated the grid template columns as well as the grid auto rows attributes. So how about the setting up of the implicit grids on the column dimension? We can take a look at it. Okay, now you can see that I have set up the grid template rows attribute to have 2 repetitions for 1 fraction and 2 fractions. So you see the first row has 1 fraction and the second row has 2 fractions. The third row has 1 fraction and the second row has 2 fractions. And the meaning of 1 fraction here is determined by the width of your words on the first row. Okay, so the 1 fraction comes from the height of the words. Okay, and of course 2 fractions refers to the doubled size of 1 fraction. Okay, and then I can set up implicit grid along the column dimension. Okay, now you can see that the grid dimension for the column is set as 80 pixels. Because I treat the column dimension as the implicit grid dimension, I just need to use grid auto columns attribute to help me set up the size of the columns. Okay, so you can see that the elements are not able to fill up the entire space of the background. So you can see the background color again, which is pale golden rod. Okay. Then we are going to talk about another topic called auto placement of items. So you can see that the items are placed mainly according to the markup order. So you see, I usually name the divisions from A, B, C onwards. Okay. So for English, the order is left to right and top to bottom, which is quite natural for the English language, which is a left to right language. Okay. So how can we demonstrate this idea? We can see this portion now. I set up the display mode first. Okay, so I can set up the grid. Okay, I set up 3 columns explicitly. And also I can set up the rows explicitly. Okay, you can see that the row size is 40 pixels for all the rows. So now I don't have any implicit grid dimensions. So the auto placement order is like this. We start with the left hand side. So we have A, B, and C from left to right. And then we will do the placement along the top and bottom order. So the second row will be D, E, and F. The third row will be G, H, and I. So this is the way of the auto placement order, which is the default way of English, which is a left to right language. Can we change the order? Yes, we can. How can we do so? We can make use of another attribute value pair called grid auto flow. Now, when I set grid auto flow attribute to be row, it just remains the default value for English, which is left to right and top to bottom. How about trying to set it up as column? When I set up the attribute to have a value of column, you can see that the order is a bit different. I will do the order as follows. I still have left to right, but I will do the placement along the column first. So the first column has A, B, and C, and the second column has D, E, and F from top to bottom, and the third column has G, H, and I from top to bottom. So that is the way to change the auto placement flow of your items. Now we are going to talk about another topic called grid lines, which is this part on the HTML file. So what's the meaning of a grid line? When we refer to the previous grid, we can see that we have some lines separating different grid cells. So this vertical line is called a grid line, which is a vertical grid line. This is also another vertical grid line. And we have a horizontal grid line on top, and we have another horizontal grid line between the first row and the second row. Okay. So these are called grid lines. And we have some ways to indicate the grid lines on CSS files. So how can we do that? When we talk about English language, the grid lines would start with 1 from left to right and from top to bottom. So this is the vertical grid line 1, this is the vertical grid line 2, the vertical grid line 3, and the vertical grid line 4. And this is the first horizontal grid line, and this is the second horizontal grid line, so on and so forth. And we have to learn one more term. The area bounded by 2 parallel grid lines are called a grid track. Okay, so I'm highlighting a certain grid track, A, B to G, okay, this part, okay. And A, B, and C also sets up a grid track. Okay, and grid cells A, B, and C also set up a grid track. Okay, so let me set up the grid first. And then how can we set up the grid line numbers? We can do so here. So for cell A, I can set the grid cell as starting with some particular lines. Now when I set up the grid column start and grid column end as 2 and 4 respectively, you can see that cell A is starting with grid line number 2 vertically, and it ends on the 4th vertical grid line. Okay, so this is the way we set up the column grid lines for cell A. Of course, we can also set up the horizontal grid lines by using other kinds of attribute value pairs. Now I also set up the horizontal grid line to start with line number 2, and grid cell A ends with horizontal grid line number 4. Okay, so grid cell A is set up explicitly in this way. So when it comes to setting up the other elements on this division, you can see that we just follow the auto placement order for English. So if I don't set up anything else, I will do the left to right direction followed by top to bottom dimension. Okay. Also, I don't need to really set up the end number in this way. Instead, I can have another way. When I use the span keyword, it just means that the ending column grid line will be the one having two more values coming from the grid column start value. So when I set up span 2 here, the vertical end will be the fourth vertical grid line, which is equal to 2 plus 2. So same for the row, I can have a similar idea. When I say span 2, I will have two more grid lines to span the cell after setting up the grid row start value, which is 2 here, which is this horizontal grid line, okay? So after spanning two more horizontal grid lines, I will end grid cell horizontally along this grid line, okay, which is grid line number 4. In addition to using this kind of approach to specify the grid lines, we can have a shorthand form, which is shown here. Okay, so how can we make use of the shorthand form? First, let me set up the grids first. Now I have set up the explicit column dimensions. So you can see I have 3 columns now. And now the row dimension becomes the implicit grid dimension. If I want to change the position of cell A, I can have something like this as the shorthand form. Okay, I just want to specify the starting vertical line for grid cell A. Now I set it as grid line number 2. And I also set up the ending grid line number for my grid cell A. So now I set it as 4. And you can see that vertical grid line number 4 is the ending line for grid cell A. I can do similar things for the implicit dimension, which is the row dimension now. So now the grid cell A will start with the second horizontal grid line, and it will end before the fourth horizontal grid line. Okay. If you just need to span one grid line, we don't need to specify the ending part. When we simply omit the ending part, it just says that you want to span one grid line horizontally and vertically in my case. And also you can use the span keyword to do the indication of your grid lines as follows. When you use span 2 here, you just want to span 2 more grid lines from the starting value given by the first part of the grid column values. You can do the same thing for the grid row values, okay? So now you know the ways to specify the grid line numbers for your elements to span, okay? Other than using numbers, we can use names to specify the grid lines. So you can simply give some names to them. So how can we do that? Let me go to the corresponding HTML file part, okay? Together with the corresponding part for my CSS file. Now you can see that I have 3 items. I can set the grid as follows. Now I want to set up the column dimensions as well as the row dimensions explicitly. Now you can see that I set up the names for my grid lines. So for the vertical grid line here, I set the name as grid1-start. And after this grid line name, I set up one fraction, followed by one more fraction. Okay, and then I set up this vertical line as having 2 names. One name is called grid1-end, and the other name is called grid2-start. So a line can have 2 or more names. We don't need to just give a line just one name. And after that, I have one more fraction, and at the end, I set up the grid line name as grid 2-end for this ending vertical grid line. So I can do similar things for the row dimensions. Okay, I set up the row dimension as follows. First, I have given a name to the very first horizontal grid line called grid 1-start. And then I set up 50 pixels for the dimension of the row. And then I give the name of the second grid line as grid 2-start. And then I give 45 pixels. And then I set the grid line as grid 1-end. And then I give 35 more pixels, and after that I have a name given to the final horizontal grid line. So because I've only 3 grid cell items, I'm not able to fill up all the space. In this case, you can see the background color coming up, but you can notice that these names are still identifiable, even though you can't see the grid lines explicitly. We have to notice that you can use the same name for both the column lines and the row lines. It is valid, and it is pretty helpful to do so when we want to specify a particular cell, so that we see how we make use of the same names for the lines and columns. Now I want to change the placement of grid cell A. Now you can see that grid cell A has a starting column along the grid 1-start line. So when it comes to handling the column grid line, we refer to the grid template columns attribute. So I just specify this line in the corresponding part. Okay, and I also specify this line. So I just make use of the names of these 2 lines to help me specify the grid cell A position. And I can also do similar things for the row dimension. Okay, when I talk about the row dimension, I just specify grid cell A dimensions to start with the first horizontal grid line, and it ends with the grid line that has this name given by grid 1-end. So I just specify this particular horizontal grid line as the end of the grid cell A element. So you can make use of the lines for your column grid lines and the row grid lines to help you change the position of your elements. I can show you one more example. How about setting up the position of cell B? We can have similar ideas. Okay, when I set the grid cell B as having these ending and starting grid lines, you can see that the grid cell B has changed its position according to the names specified inside the grid template columns and the grid template rows attributes. Okay, so for the grid cell B, the columns would start with this line, which is having this name, and it will end vertically along the grid line that has this name. Same for the row dimension. Okay. When we want to combine different grid cells, we can set your grid area. So how can we set up the grid area? We can make use of some properties now. Now I set up the grid template columns. Okay. Now I can make use of the grid line numbers to help me set up the grid area. Okay, I want to set grid cell A to have this particular area, indicated by these numbers. So the first number refers to the grid row start grid line, which is a horizontal grid line. And the second value is referring to the grid column start value. The third value corresponds to the grid row end, and the fourth value corresponds to the grid column end. So after I have set up the grid lines, I can simply use the grid area property to help me determine the position of your particular grid cells, which now turn to a grid area. Okay. After setting up the grid areas, we can make use of the grid areas to help you tessellate your web page. How can we do so? We can make use of the grid template areas. So let me go to this part for my HTML file and the CSS file. Now I want to set up the names for each grid cell. How can we do that? We can do something like this. So I give the name of this grid cell part-A. I can do similar things for my remaining divisions. Now I have a name for each grid area. Okay. So grid cell A is called part A, grid cell B is called part B, so on and so forth. If we want to make use of these grid areas to set up your particular grid template, we can do something like this now. I set up the grids first, and then I can simply make use of the grid template areas keyword. Okay, now I set up the grid template areas as follows. I have 4 rows, so you see I have 4 rows, and for the first row I have 3 portions of part A, which is simply grid cell A, so you can see that grid cell A is combined together. And for part B, I have 4 values coming from the grid template areas. So these 4 parts would be joined together. Okay. And for part C, you have these 4 parts joined together. And for part D, you have only 1 part. And for part E, you have 3 parts joined together. Finally, for part F, you have the final row joined together. So you can make use of the grid area names to help you specify the ways to combine or position your grid areas. If you don't want to set up a certain portion, you can simply make use of a dot. So if I want to ignore some part of grid cell A, I can simply do something like this. Okay, I just put 1 dot to replace the first part A value. So in this case, you can see that I only use 2 portions to do the part A, which is simply meaning the grid cell A. So this part becomes empty when I use a dot to replace the grid area name. Okay. And we have to notice something. No L-shaped cells are allowed. So that means we cannot simply create L-shaped grid areas. We have to make rectangular areas. So when you just want to create an L-shaped pattern, the entire statement becomes invalid. Okay. We can also have a shorthand form for the grid templates. How can we do that? We can go to the corresponding HTML file part first. And I want to show the corresponding CSS part as well. Now I set the grid first. I set grid cell A to have a name called part-A, and I do the same thing for my other portions. Now I have given the names of different grid areas. Now I make use of the shorthand form now. I use the property called grid template. Okay. So I can say something for now. I want to set up the first row to have part A, part A, part A, part B, and part B. And the row dimension is 40 pixels. So we just want to follow the grid template areas followed by the grid template rows pattern for each row. Now I have set up the grid template partially. I have 4 rows, and each row has a size of 40 pixels, 45 pixels, 50 pixels, and 35 pixels respectively. And finally, I need to set up the grid template column values. Okay, the grid template columns are set as follows. I have 5 portions, and I have set up 1 portion for each column. So you can see that part A occupies 3 portions, while part B occupies 2 portions. So you can make use of the grid template attribute to help you do the shorthand form of the grid template areas. So you specify the area layout followed by the row dimension, and at the end you have a / and you specify the column dimension. Okay. So in this video, you have already seen a lot of examples of the grid setup. So you can try to understand the ideas, and you can just play with the different attribute value pairs to learn how to set up the grids. So the important thing is that a grid layout is a 2-dimensional layout. So you have to consider the column dimension as well as your row dimensions. This is the end of the video. If you have any questions about my video, please leave your questions on the comment section below the video. If you like this video, please give me a like and please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching.